A successful digital transformation is largely contingent on how well and effectively you establish a project team. And what I want to talk about today is how exactly to establish an effective project team. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformation journeys. And when we're working with clients, one of the most common questions we get is how do we structure our project team for our digital transformation? How do we leverage outside resources? What sort of internal resources do we need? What does our project manager need to do? What does our steering committee need to do? All those sorts of things are common questions that we get. So what I want to talk about today is what a typical transformation project team looks like. But then I also want to shift gears and talk about what a typical transformation team should look like. So I'll start off by talking about what the traditional team looks like, and then we'll come back and talk about the things that you can do to modify that approach to make your transformation more successful. So the first role on a project team, and arguably the most important role on a project team, is your executive steering committee. And this is typically a cross-functional group of executives within your organization that are responsible for setting the vision for the overall transformation. They're responsible for approving scope changes or any sort of material changes to the project plan or the budget. And they're also responsible for setting the tone and the vision for the overall future state. How do we want our operation model to look? What do we want our organization to look like in the future? For lack of a better word, what do we want to be when we grow up? And that all starts here with the steering committee. And before I get into the rest of the project team, something that's very important even before we talk about other team roles and who should fill these other roles, is that before you get into bringing on other team members, the first thing you want to do is make sure that the steering committee is aligned on the overall transformation vision, strategy, and objectives, and make sure you have a clear vision for what you want this transformation to be. If you start filling out the project team prematurely when you don't have that alignment and clarity at the steering committee level, you're going to run into trouble and you're going to run into a lot of headwinds and internal conflict and tension because you don't have that clear vision. So that steering committee is an important role. And another important thing to note about the steering committee is the steering committee is typically also responsible for any sorts of project governance that should be escalated to the steering committee. So things like project scope changes, as I mentioned, or budgetary changes, or changes to the business process operating model. All those are things that the steering committee should be responsible for. Now, the next role to be thinking about is your project manager. And this is a role that I'm going to come back to because there's the traditional way of doing things and there's the way things should be done. And typically what happens is you have an internal project manager that's responsible for reporting to the steering committee, and they're responsible for everything that happens on the project. Now, typically, this is an internal resource. You might have a project manager or project leads from outside consultants or your system integrator or your vendor, but ultimately you need someone internally that's managing the overall project. They're responsible for all the resources, all the work streams, and everything that we're going to talk about here throughout this video. Now, the next thing that project teams typically consist of, we work our way down here, is you will have the technical lead. You might also refer to this as the technical project manager. Now, this is the person that's responsible for overseeing all of the functional aspects and the technical aspects of design and testing and everything related to the technology that you've selected and implemented. Now, typically what happens is people confuse this role with this role. So for example, you hire a system integrator, they provide a technical project manager, and oftentimes organizations think, well, that's my project manager that belongs here, and that's not true. The reality is your system integrator typically will fill just this one work stream, and I'm going to come back to that point here in just a minute. So within this stream here, within this box, you're also going to have a series of process leads or functional leads. And typically you'll have things like, someone responsible for CRM. And these are going to be, we'll call these process leads. And again, they could also be referred to as functional leads. But generally you're going to have a lead that's responsible for each area of your organization. So you might have CRM, you might have finance, you might have warehouse management, you might have manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. depending on what industry you're in, obviously these functional areas are going to vary, and depending on what the scope of your transformation is, these functional areas are going to vary. But generally, you'll have someone who's responsible for leading these functional and technical areas for that specific part of your business. Now, here's where you see a blend of resources, of internal and external resources. You'll have typically someone that leads each of these module or functional areas from the system integrator or the vendor, but they're usually partnering with someone internally from your organization to work together to figure out what the future state processes and the design of the software is going to look like. They'll be responsible for testing the software, for training people at the end of the day, all the things that go into that specific part of the transformation. And then within each of these little areas here, you may or may not have other supporting team members. So you might have down here for each of these areas, typically, especially if you're a larger organization, you're going to have multiple people supporting each of these areas as subject matter experts. So these are typically internal resources that are specific to one part of that functional area. So for example, within finance, you might have someone that's responsible for accounts payable. Within CRM, you might have a SME that's just responsible for customer service, another one that's responsible for sales within one of your divisions, and then you might have someone else that's responsible for sales in another division. So you're going to have a series of subject matter experts down here, which is going to vary depending on the size and complexity of your organization. Now, in addition to these internal subject matter experts, typically the software vendor may have additional resources beyond each of the process and functional leads that they provide to help provide the technical and functional capabilities for that specific software. Now, here's where I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the difference between what a project organization typically looks like versus what it should look like. Now, typically, people myopically focus on this part of the org chart, and they sort of hone in on this as the overall project. And the reality is this is not the overall project. First and foremost, as I mentioned before, this technical lead is oftentimes confused as being the project manager. So what we want to do here is, first of all, understand the difference between these two roles. So in order to be successful, we want to make sure that we're not assuming that the SI is going to fill this role. The SI belongs here, the technical lead or the technical project manager. And as we're going to discuss here in a minute, there's other work streams here that have nothing to do with the system integrator, but are critical to the project. Now, the problem and the thing to think about as you're getting proposals and looking at potential options for how you deploy your new technology is that the system integrator is typically going to focus right here. And that might mislead you into thinking that's all you need to worry about. But the reality is you need to put a project manager over their team. And then you have another series of project teams or sub-teams that are going to fit in parallel with the technical work stream. So for example, you should have a data lead. And this is the person that's responsible for making sure that the data gets cleansed, that we've got a migration plan, that we establish master data management processes to make sure that the data stays cleansed or clean post-implementation. That data lead, typically you want that to be independent from the technology side, although they do need to work very closely in conjunction with the technical side. So this is one area you want to make sure that you've changed or modified from that traditional approach. Now, another area that oftentimes gets overlooked is the whole change management side of things. So generally, you're going to have a change lead, and you may even have supporting change resources that support that change management lead. Now, the change team here is going to be responsible for making sure that not only people get trained and that we're leveraging the knowledge over here from the technical side, but that we're modifying the training to fit your specific business processes and your specific technology that you're deploying. But even more importantly, prior to training, change management's responsible for making sure we've designed the organization the way it needs to be, we've identified change impacts, we've ensured that we have stakeholder alignment, including at the steering committee level, and other change management activities. And for more on this, I have a ton of videos on my YouTube channel that talk about change management and how to deploy change management programs within your organization. So I won't go into a lot of detail here, but I do encourage you to check that out. And I also encourage you to check out our guide to organizational change management, which I've included a link to below, and that'll give you some more tips on how to manage this change management work stream. And then in addition to change management, you typically are also going to want to have, not necessarily at this project level, but more, I would say, more off on the side, we'll just put sort of a dotted line here that's working, really reporting up to the program management office, but supporting these different work streams here. And one of those roles is the system architect. So someone that can look at the overall big picture of technology and identify how integration is going to look, how the different systems are going to be commissioned or decommissioned, I should say, if they're being replaced, what kind of integration we're going to have. And they also work very closely with the data lead as well to make sure that we know where the single source of truth is and how data is going to flow between systems. So this system architect role is very important, especially if you're in a best of breed environment. Let's assume here that you're deploying one single ERP system as your core, but you might have other technical leads that are supporting other technologies. And that's another important point I want to make here on the technical work stream, is that let's just say you're implementing SAP as your core ERP system. You might have SAP as your core, but then you might also have Salesforce CRM as part of your CRM aspect of your deployment, in which case you would have another technical project team over here that's focused on the Salesforce side of it, and your system architect would be the one to tie all those pieces together, or at least have that blueprint or vision of how all the technology ties together. So you want to make sure you don't forget about that system architect piece. And then the other really important role that you don't want to forget about is the business process owner. So someone that's looking globally at business processes across the board. And oftentimes people say, well, we've already got that covered down here. We've got these functional leads that are looking at business processes. And they are, but these people down here are typically looking at how are we going to design the software? How are we going to design workflows within the technology? But we don't have necessarily a framework, bigger picture framework for how business processes should look, what those process improvements should look like, how we're going to incorporate changes and improvements to our business processes into our program. All that stuff needs to kind of come from the top down within the project team. So having a business process lead or someone that's looking at business process management, business process reengineering, that's a very important role that can support these other areas as well. And then last, but certainly not least, and arguably most importantly, in fact, is another role that oftentimes organizations don't recognize the need for, and that is quality assurance. So someone that can be sort of outside looking in, identifying risks, mitigating risks, helping the steering committee and other parts of the project team make decisions as it relates to their business, and really tying this all together. And what happens oftentimes when you're working on a project team, and if you've ever been involved with a transformation, you can probably relate to this, is you tend to get so far down in the weeds day to day during a transformation, and things are moving so quickly that it becomes very easy to forget or not have the time to back up and look at the big picture and identify all the different pitfalls and risks that are out on the horizon. And that's the role that a quality assurance person can provide. This is something that, for example, our team at Third Stage provides for clients, and we do this for a lot of clients in their implementations, is providing that quality assurance role. Even in cases where we're acting as an extension of our client's project management team and supporting their internal project manager to make sure they can manage all this stuff effectively, we'll typically still have a separate quality assurance person that's more of an objective outsider that has that fresh perspective and isn't involved in all the day-to-day stuff, but can back up and look and see all the big risks that might be percolating under the surface. So as you're constructing your project team, these are some of the areas you want to make sure you don't overlook. As I mentioned, this part is pretty common. That's usually pretty straightforward. Most organizations get this part of the org chart. But these areas here with check marks are areas that oftentimes get overlooked. And when you're defining your overall project plan, your resource plan, your budget, all that stuff, you want to make sure you're not basing it just on this, but that you're looking at the whole picture of everything that's required to make the project successful so that ultimately you can be more effective. And even though it may not seem like it, having this project structure in place is typically going to be cheaper and faster than trying to do it just with this team. So I hope this has provided some guidance on how to structure your project team and given you some things to think about as you structure your project team. For more information on this, I encourage you to check out some of the links that I've included in the description below, including our 2021 Digital Transformation Report, which includes a lot of best practices around how to structure an implementation, how to structure a team, how to handle change management. It even includes some of the top system rankings across a number of different verticals. So I encourage you to download that for more information. I hope you found this information useful. Have a great day.